Good morning, everybody. It's an honor to share our thoughts and reflections on the Corona event with you in the context of what we call the imperative of our time to safeguard lives and safeguard livelihoods. The virus, with its exponential growth, is coming closer to us in Europe, and I know many of you know people that have Corona. Many people know people that are in the hospital, and you also will know people that have passed away, or you know people that have passed away. So this thing is close to us, it's personal, and it's a humanitarian moment, humanitarian crisis first and foremost. I know in your businesses you're taking care of people, you're trying to work in a different way, or even in some sectors work has been suspended, and that is also has also an effect on the economic situation of your business or your institution and the countries that we live in. What we wanted to update you on is the situation on Corona itself, and then try to bound the uncertainty around the virus and its spread, as well as the economic shock and its spread, to give guidance in a scenario way on what might lie ahead. And then we'll talk about the impacts on jobs and what are the findings on restart from Asia with my two colleagues. So on the next page, we can recognize now that this COVID situation is a fully global event. Every country is affected. I think there's 2 or 3 areas where we don't know enough, which is in Africa and parts of South America and Southeast Asia. And I think that's an information gap, and it's also a narrative gap that we need to continue to study. But this, in a way, shows the virus dictates what's happening here, because everywhere where the virus comes, the energy response on the health side and the economic side and stimulus side has been significant. On the next page, we can also see that in the share of cases, the US and Europe are now leading, while the early Asian countries have abated. And so this is becoming a global event where lessons circle through. Asia has been most ahead and is now abating. Europe is in the middle of plateauing and abating, and the United States, in certain areas, the plateau is happening and some abatement is happening, but there's a little bit of a delay in that sequence, and we're focusing on Europe a little bit more in this conversation as we go through. On the next page, we're going to introduce the scenarios, which is on page 6. You can advance one forward. We all know the top end of this picture, which has been the story about flattening the curve. That's why we're in lockdown, that's why we're in shelter in place, that's why we have physical distance. We have to also know that hospital capacity not everywhere is significant enough, and therefore we are working hard on expanding treatment and testing. And of course, we all hope that we find cures, be it the treatment, the vaccine, or drugs that help us get through this moment better. Increasingly over the last weeks, I would say, it has become clear, and of course this was clear in China and Korea and so on as well, that associated with the suppression efforts towards the virus is a very significant economic shock, because we're doing something that we've never done before. We actually tell large swaths of the population to work from home or to not work at all. And the total impact of that is something like a 40 to 50% drop in discretionary spending. It's slightly different by category. Investments jitter and import-export jitter, depending on the arrangements. And net, you can see a 8 to 13% level drop in GDP, which is the largest economic shock since World War II, and also larger than the first quarter of the Great Depression. Governments have realized that this was about to happen, and almost ahead of this happening, we're already announcing massive amount of stimulus to support people and businesses affected by the lockdowns. Increasingly, there's the conversation about how to get back to work safely, how to get back to life safely. And then, of course, we will have to have the discussion on how to scale the recovery away fast, so that we basically have a dual mission to time box the virus and to time box the economic shock. And in a way, we don't see this as a dilemma, but we see it as a dual imperative. When we were working the article that is written about this, there was a Wall Street Journal article that talked about that at some point we might have to face a choice between the two imperatives. There would be a trade-off between lives and livelihoods. We actually don't see it that way, and we came out quite strongly saying this is a and, not an or. And in a way, the time boxing of the virus also time boxes the economic event because they're associated. That's the statement that we wanted to make here. It turns out that in the press narrative, also in Wall Street Journal, a week later, they also talked about this is maybe not the dilemma. I think framing it at that dilemma initially was good because it raised people's eyebrows to this conversation. And we're now in the dual conversation, I think, centrally. From an uncertainty perspective, on the next page, I want to tee up where we are from a scenario perspective. On the vertical axis, we talk about the spread of the virus and the public health response. And you could imagine the top row to be a situation where we sort of abate the virus, suppress it as fast as the early Asian countries. It takes 2 to 3 months to be all the way down and cautiously open up the economy. And I want to repeat this, Young Ming will talk about this later. The opening up in the Asian countries is not a 0 to 1. It's in steps, it's with learning, it's regional, it's different, and it's cautious. If I don't say this wrong, there's a Chinese saying that for winter you put on your coat quickly and then you take it off a few times because there's a lot of false springs and put it back on. And that is also happening with the virus. You can also imagine that we're going to be a little less effective with the virus, whether that is in Asia or in the Western world. But then on the horizontal axis, to cushion the blow of this economic shock, governments are doing massive amounts of stimulus. The range is announced in Germany to the United States from every other country and every walk of life is somewhere in the range of 5% in the developing markets to 10 to 35% if you add it all up on what is in the cards for stimulus. And the question is that stimulus going to be, and the deregulation and any other measure that are being taken for furloughing and supporting people, supporting businesses, are they going to be effective, partially effective, or actually ineffective? It's not so hard to imagine a world where it might be less effective. Because if I give a person who's furloughed or unemployed $1,000 per person or $3,000 per family, will they spend it? Well, maybe not. Maybe they will wait until they have their job back. And that brings me to the two leading indicators on this chart. On the vertical axis, the leading indicator towards do we have this lockdown working and do we have the suppression working is the number of patients coming into the hospital requiring critical care. The moment that starts to plateau and drop, you can see the measures are working. And in China and the early Asian countries, this has worked. In Europe, we now are happy to report that we have reached plateau and drops in the number of patients coming in. So Western-style lockdowns do work. And the early signals in New York are also suggesting this. So it means that we have seen in the Western world that our approach works to have the effect on the patient flows coming in. And of course, we're expanding hospital capacity to be able to deal with the resurgence and so on. But it at least suggests we know it works. What we don't know yet is how long it will take fully to get down, because there's a bit of plateauing effect still. On the economic side, on the intervention side, here's the leading indicator that I suggest to think about is how active are we on planning to get back to work? Because that's not something you can follow in an app, but you have to talk to people. So in having talked to 10, 20 different governments all across the world over the last 4 weeks, I've seen a shift of 4 weeks ago, people were really only busy with the suppression and the support. Whereas over the last 4 weeks, a massive shift has occurred to it become a prime minister presidential issue to how to get back to work. And that is a very big focus for the governments. But similarly, when I talk to CEOs, 2 weeks ago, early 2 weeks ago, very few CEOs were busy for their own companies, think about how to get back to work in all branches, from office to back office to front office and so on. And literally in the last week, 70% of the CEOs are busy directing their companies on how to get back to work in all the different jobs, including office jobs, and so on. Of course, very different by sector. If you then look at the economic event in this, we've been modeling the central two, A1 and A3. A3 is a U.S. type recovery, where you basically, you go down in China earlier and you come back up, and basically it takes 6 to 8 months to be back to level. So basically, end of this year, early next year, you can feel us being back to level after this very, very large drop. China looks time shifted, so therefore in Q2 you don't see it as much, but China has this thing behind itself. But a case that's a bit worse, or significantly worse, is A1, the next page, where basically you see the China go down and come back up. And if you could go back, Peter, to the scenario slide for one moment, 2 clicks back, I just want to say that we just published an article in which we got the votes from global executives on the scenarios, on what they saw as this spread. And while we described A1 and A3, A1 gets the majority primary votes. 36% of executives globally believe A1 is the central scenario, and A3 gets the second set of votes, which is 16%, i.e. A1 and A3 together get the majority of the votes. However, I would say somewhat surprisingly, the sum total of the D boxes, which include L shapes and longer U's and W's in terms of the shape, got 40% of the vote. And this is not actually sectorally dependent, so we thought maybe, sectors that are way down, like airlines, the executives there would vote into that area. It was actually, people were really voting about the world and the economy. There was a slight geographical difference, where in China, it was more in the A3, A4 box. In India, Southeast Asia, and Latin, it was more between A3 and A1. And in Europe, US, it was a little bit like the average vote, with 36 in the middle and 16 in A3. So this board that we've put up, in a way, is, from how people think about it, the full range of scenarios is still in the minds of people. I've done a similar effort in 08 and 09, where we also modeled a 9-box matrix. And at the start of that event, we saw the same spread with a little bit of centrality to the vote. And we hope, as we keep calling this every 1 or 2 weeks, to see over time a convergence. And of course, we're hopeful that that converges into one of the better scenarios rather than one of the worst scenarios. So let's go forward again to just talk about these scenarios one more. Here you see the quarterly comparison for the Eurozone and the UK in it, which, the patterns are similar, but you have this idea, on just how close this is to the Great Recession and the Great Depression in the beginning. But then the duration is really the question. Are we in the 6 to 8 months duration, or are we in the longer duration? And can keep moving forward. There are differences, at the sub-region level. This is just an example of France. Therefore, we believe as this opens up, we will also continue to see regional differences on the opening up and maybe also regional reclosings as it opens. And the surrounding conditions for the healthcare event in Europe are also very different on the next slide. If you look at it from a virus perspective versus healthcare capacity, clearly we have Germany stand out on the right with a lot of healthcare capacity and being able to deal with it. But the virus spread is still quite varying. It has to do with testing somewhat, but in general, that's a widespread thing. I want to tee up 2 more ways to think about this and then move over to our next speaker, which is on the next slide. When I talk to leaders and executives, all companies and all institutions have some form of a crisis response, crisis team that works on the work from home, business continuity, supply chain, supporting customers, and so on. Many work groups that are just very hard at work to deal with the event. Given the size of the economic shock, and given the virus resurgence potentially, we believe that the future will be full of events that it would be proper to simulate and then plan ahead for them. These events might include government intervention in certain sectors. It might be M&A. It might be bailouts. It might be support of customers. But we think the range of these events is going to expand so significantly that it is important to add to your efforts, which is in the crisis team, a planning ahead team that tries to prepare you for future events in what is the largest economic shock in a long time. You can do that in a couple of frames in page 14. Getting a realistic view of your starting position, continue to develop scenarios not just at the macro level, but also at the sector level and at the event level. Establish your posture in them, determine the moves that you might make, but then also figure out whether you need to act now. If you believe your sector will be in deep trouble in 3 months, you might want to plan not just for your company, but for the sector too, and start engaging with people on how to solve the sector now, not just when the trouble is coming. I know everybody's planning for liquidity, for example, and which is very, very important. But if you're having a sector that will be in trouble in 3 months from now, then maybe you also need to add that to your solution. And as people make these solutions on page 15, we see very few businesses thinking that business model disruption is limited and the demand disruption is limited. I see companies that are planning 100% up. I see companies that are planning a 50% down. I see companies that in certain businesses have a 50 up and another one 30 down. There's very few that are in the guide rails of their planning. And so we see the challenge in planning ahead to disrupt business models, to change the shape of business because of demand, to restructure your company but also your industry while you sustain your business and restore operations in this COVID event. And as we then progress over time, and that's my last point I want to make, we will be moving through probably 5 frames as we go forward. We're resolving on the next page, we're resolving the crisis as it's happening. We're trying to be resilient for the event. We're starting to think about the return, but we will at some point work on reimagination and reform. And we believe these are useful frames to think as this moment event. I will just say one thing about my optimism in all of this, because some good things are happening while we're going through the largest economic shock ever applied, and we're going through something that is a health shock that we haven't seen in a long time. While we're doing that, the largest innovation engine ever seen on the planet is currently in motion. That is not just technical innovation, it's also behavioral innovation, it's also collaboration innovation. More companies are collaborating with government and amongst themselves to get things moving and to get us back to work than I've ever seen. And I hope we could retain 10 to 20% of that. I think the current way is a little tiring, but if we could retain 10 to 20% of the pace that we're moving right now, beautiful things will continue to happen. And my hope is that in 2 to 3 years now, when we look back on this, what feels chaotic now, painful and uncertain, will feel like a job well done in the context that this is a 1 in 60 years viral event and a 1 in 100 years economic shock. And if we can get from what feels chaotic now to a place that you look back, we dealt with it and we've been innovating and learning, that just would be the hope that I express. But there's some optimism in me that says we are dealing with this thing at an unbelievable pace. And I will just say one thing. If you had done a think out of the box session 1 year ago, I don't think you've imagined anything that's happening right now. In my country, we would not have predicted people to stand in line for a supermarket discipline to wait for their turn to go in and do their shopping. And that happened in 3 weeks for the entire nation with really only small protests, very, very small protests. Stuff like that is just amazing. And I just hope that that's the context as we progress through it on what is a humanitarian moment that has 2 imperatives, to safeguard lives and to safeguard our livelihoods.
Thank you very much, Sven, for that. We just have one question that came in that you may want to pick up right away, which is, do we have a perspective on how long the cross-border travel restrictions might continue within the EU and between the EU and non-EU? For many sectors, this is a key factor to determine the speed of recovery. Is that something that we looked at?
So there are two kinds of travel. One is goods travel and goods shipment, and the other one is people travel and so on. And then, of course, the mode of transport matters. On goods travel, I think increasingly people are finding solutions, and it's being solved leg by leg, destination by destination, goods by goods. And it hasn't gone to a standstill anyway, but I think you can see that that's trying to be sorted with protocol of handover and so on to minimize contagion and so on. At the other end of the spectrum, the people, we know whether the people had the disease and therefore they're not contagious, and that then needs to happen at the origination and the destination. And just if you know where the testing curves are, it'll take a little bit of time until we are at the point that we have full testing. So I think you see the full spectrum between goods and people in an airplane. You see in China, I mean, you can talk about it, is the trains are not full, and for purpose they're not full because of contagion risk and so on. And so we're all learning on that still, but there's a wide spectrum of what will come back soon. I think driving with a car across the border could be possible as long as people hold social distancing in Europe and so on. But I think it won't be to go to a big event soon.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll now move over to Tara Alice, who's going to talk about the impact on jobs in Europe. Thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Sven. As Sven said, this is a 100-year economic event, so inevitably it will have also enormous consequences for employment across Europe and indeed across the world. And it's a very unprecedented event, so it is hard to predict exactly what will happen. But what I will do in the next 5 to 10 minutes is just give you a bit of an idea of what's already happening, what we can already see about the scale of the impact. What our modeling suggests in those two scenarios that Sven outlined in more detail would happen to employment in Europe. And then very importantly, how unevenly these effects will be felt by different groups of people across the different regions of Europe. So what are we already seeing? Well, of course, we've seen an enormous jump in first-time unemployed in the US, and we're seeing something very similar happening in European countries. So on the next slide, we've plotted what's happening here in the UK, where I'm based, to claims to universal credit. Not everybody claiming universal credit will be somebody who threatens to be unemployed or is unemployed, but nevertheless is indicative. And we can see that for a very long time, the weekly applications for universal credit have hovered around 60 to 70,000 a week. And in the 2 weeks for which we have data in March, they jumped to roughly 450,000 per week. So this is a dramatic change in how vulnerable people are feeling about their incomes and about their jobs. And of course, has created significant issues in terms of just the administration of dealing with all of those people, but most importantly will be an issue for their livelihoods. Now, in the UK, where I'm based, we have for the last couple of years been celebrating the fact that we have record employment and record low unemployment. And sadly, it does look like that's now definitely come to an end. So if we take that number that we have in March and predict it forward, Peter, can you go back to my slides? Are moving on my screen, so if you can go back. Yes, thank you. Then we might be looking at an unemployment rate in the UK in April going from 3.9% earlier this year to 5.2%, so a significant increase. And of course, we're seeing similar kinds of things happening in other countries. So in the next slide, if we look at Germany, Germany has a scheme called Kurzarbeit, which means that people, if they work fewer hours and therefore employers don't lay people off, but allow them to work fewer hours and government facilities some part of their income. The run rate of applications to the Kurzarbeit program has historically been kind of around 1,000 applications per month. That jumped to 1,900 in February, and in March to April the 6th, that went up to 650,000. So we're seeing a very dramatic increase in those applications. And if you project this forward, then we might be looking at up to 10 million unemployed people in Germany by the end of April. So these are momentous sizes of shifts in a very, very short period of time. That also makes them quite hard to model. We nevertheless do have on the next slide model outputs for what the implications of the economic shock might be. On the left-hand side, we're looking at Europe without the UK, and the right-hand side, we have the UK numbers. And the white line is basically a scenario where the virus is rapidly contained and we can lift the lockdowns relatively quickly and people can get back to work. And in most cases, or in many cases, maybe will only just have been furloughed by their employer rather than being laid off altogether. And also people might not, in that scenario, end up being unemployed for very long. And you can see that that would give us a fairly mild uptick in unemployment in the short term, but then a return back to broadly where we were relatively quickly. In the muted recovery scenario, which Sven mentioned was the most likely scenario as judged by our global executive panel, we see a significant increase in unemployment, as you would expect. In the European countries, excluding the UK, we see it going up to similar levels to the ones we had in 2012. In the UK, we haven't seen this level of unemployment up to around 9% for a very large number of years. Now, these blue lines, which show our muted recovery scenario, still do expect unemployment to start falling. It will take a while to fall back, but it probably won't be quite as bad as the Great Depression in the 30s, just because right now governments around the place are very focused on avoiding structural damage, tiding people over, preferring furloughs to layoffs, and trying to ensure that the number of people who are permanently unemployed and might therefore end up being starved by this experience, might start losing their skills, might become long-term unemployed, is minimized. Now, as I said earlier, the impacts, however, of this unemployment are going to be felt extremely differently by different sectors and by different types of people. So if we look at the next page, I'm going to illustrate this with some data from the UK. What we've done here is we've taken the 369 different occupations for which there is data in the UK. And on the x-axis, we've looked at two big factors that either make workers in those sectors and occupations vulnerable or not very vulnerable. The first factor is, from the point of view of social distancing, do they need to work remotely? In other words, is their workplace somewhere busy with lots of people that might get infected? And so that would be a supermarket, that could be a holiday camp, that could be a restaurant, or that could be an amusement park, a sports event, places like that. So in order to not spread the virus, those people would theoretically need to work remotely. And then we've also looked at whether they could work remotely. So is there something that will require special equipment, where the delivery of the service actually requires physical presence with the person? Or, if you're a bus driver, you're a van driver, obviously you cannot work from home. And by definition, people working at restaurants or movie theaters cannot work from home. The place of work is defined. So that gives us a vulnerability rating. And then on the y-axis, we've literally just plotted the hourly wages of people in those occupations and then created this graph based on sectors. And it is rather shocking and not unexpected, but really stark the degree to which people who are professionals who work in high-earning sectors such as computer programming or ICT or in professional services or indeed financial sector are relatively more able to work from home, first of all, because a lot of their work involves speaking and digital means of communication. They do need to work remotely because even their offices are relatively crowded, so they don't want to spread the virus. If you contrast that to people obviously who work in the lockdown sectors, well, their jobs are incredibly vulnerable. They don't have any demand for those workers anymore. But even in grocery retail, there are, of course, risks in contagion of the virus. Now, there are sectors here that are key worker sectors like education and health, which are a bit of an exception. But the point is that we have previously already at the MGI been concerned about and written about inequality, and there is no doubt that this type of crisis where the workers who are most vulnerable are also the ones who are currently already on lower incomes, is going to increase that inequality. And the final thing I will share with you is the next page, again using UK data as an example, is that when you take these occupations and you look at how they're concentrated regionally, you find exactly the same pattern, that a lot of the professional workers who are able to work from home and or where their work doesn't require them to socially distance are very much concentrated in the London and the Southeast area, where, of course, in the UK, as you can see on the left-hand map, we also have the highest incomes, whereas the more vulnerable workers, who tend to be in certain types of manufacturing, in retail, in more value-added service jobs, are much more evenly spread across the country, and therefore those areas where they don't have these professional workers will probably be worse hit. Now, as Sven said earlier, what this really implies is that every region is different. Probably coming out of the crisis, not only do we need some international and national coordination for planning the right sequence of steps, but we will also need significant local and regional planning to ensure that people get back to work as quickly as possible. So that's where I would like to end the discussion on jobs, and happy to either hand over to Jung-Min or answer some questions.
Thank you, Tara. There was one question that came in to you, which is why, if this crisis is worse than 2008, is unemployment not estimated to go higher than after 2008?
There are basically two big reasons. One is the fact that the crisis is big because of an external event, and therefore as the lockdowns start to be lifted, you would expect, if the lockdown period is relatively it's relatively narrow, for quite a lot of those sectors in terms of demand to bounce back and for employment to bounce back as well. It's not the same as the financial crisis, which had a very long shadow in the economy. That's one reason why this could happen. The second reason is this time round, as Sven mentioned, governments are taking extremely seriously the risk of people losing their jobs, and they are putting in a lot of fiscal and other types of support to support people's incomes, and in fact to encourage businesses to furlough workers rather than lay them off. And that means that the bouncing back is more likely to happen more quickly. So those two factors will, government action right now to minimize the number of long-term unemployed, and the fact that as we start lifting these lockdowns, that will itself start to generate more demand, even though to some degree it might take a little bit longer for that to recover.
Okay, there was one other question that just came in about the geographical implications, and the question is, in the analysis of work vulnerability, do you also take population density into account? I would assume, says the questioner, that on-site working will be more risky in densely populated London rather than, for example, northern Scotland.
So this analysis doesn't factor that in explicitly. Of course, you will find that the density of those kinds of jobs is also stronger in London than it is in Scotland. So implicitly, some of it is captured here, but not explicitly.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Tara. And I will now hand over to Jung-Min, who's in Shanghai and who himself has gone through quarantine. So he's not only professionally but also personally experienced in what the Asian measures have actually meant. Thank you, Jung-Min.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I certainly have the first-hand experience in Asia. So I'm Korean working in China, so I have a good observation on both countries. And in Asia, we see the early indication of virus getting contained, right? Especially in China, and that's where we see a glimpse of quick recovery scenario, which is A4 in that 9-box framework that Sven introduced. And let me share our observations. So on this page, if you look at these daily high-frequency indicators, you already see that a lot of urban activities, they actually recovered to the pre-COVID situation. So in terms of the congestion, the traffic congestion, air pollution, all those real estate activities, it is, back to the pre-COVID situation around, the 100%. But then there was also a question about the mobility. So if you look at this daily passenger volume in rail, in road, in aircraft, it is still about 30% of the COVID situation. So as Sven mentioned, still there is a very cautious approach in terms of this economic recovery. Both from the authorities as well as the citizens, right? So essential movement of people and logistics are happening, right? But then a lot of leisure and discretionary related movements are not. So that is why it is only 30%. And if you look at the box office, right, the activity is virtually zero, right? Again, Chinese authorities are very, very cautious. Basically all the theaters still remain closed, right? And in Shanghai, there is a very famous tourist destination, Oriental Pearl Tower. They opened and now they closed because there was an increase in cases of so-called asymptomatic cases, so it remained closed, right? So you see, this different pace of economic activities in China. It is recovering, but very cautious. So that's our observation, the first observation. Next page. So behind this economic recovery, there is relatively optimistic Chinese consumers. So we do this monthly consumer sentiment check. About half of Chinese consumers are saying that they're actually very optimistic, meaning that the economy will rebound and to the strong or even stronger level. And that is probably because a lot of factories are operating again. So if you look at the official statistics, about 95%, 100% of the companies are getting back to the operation. So the work resumption ratio that government is announcing. So the real productivity adjustment ratio could be 20 to 30 percentage point lower, but certainly there is a trend of this operating. So that gives a sense of a bit of stability in terms of employment. So they remain closed, and at the same time, the household savings ratio in China is very high, around 30%. So that gives enough buffer, especially to middle class consumers. So that's probably why they still remain relatively optimistic. Next page. So if you look at the actual payment situation, so this is offline payment data. So we analyze about 100 million payers data and how they are spending. So during the COVID situation, yes, there was a big drop, about 60%, but these days it is recovered up to the 80%. So if you look at the data last week, it will be probably higher. So this is the offline spending data, and if you look at online data, there will be huge surge, right? And it is not unusual to see 100%, 200% growth of some of the other online players in China. So again, in terms of the actual spending and payment is also increasing and getting back to normal. So next page. So here is an observation in terms of how companies responded to the crisis and reactivated their business. And let me just highlight a few of them. Number one is about over-indexing in terms of health and safety measure. So in other parts of the world, there is a discussion about social distancing or physical distancing, which is at an individual level. In China, it is about community distancing. So basically, factories or companies, they are insulating their entire operation from outside. So there is this big community distancing measurement adopted by the Chinese players. Number two is about having a supply chain view, right? So even if your factories are operational, if your suppliers cannot supply the components, then you also have to shut down your factory. So that is number two. Number four, the redeployment of the resources, that can happen both internally and externally. So internally, companies put their resources to the front line so that they can, focus more on demand generation. There was an auto company where they make their top executives go on live streaming and then sell and promote the sales of the automotive products. That shows the commitment of the company. There's a cosmetics company, they just overnight turn their offline sales beauty consultants into online sales consultants as well. So let them open up their WeChat account and do live streaming. So that kind of massive redeployment of resource can happen internally. It can also happen across companies as well. So there's a lending and borrowing of employment from hospitality or restaurant where there's a big hit in terms of the employment toward digital players like the e-commerce players or logistics players. So cross-company employment, labor deployment also happened in China. And number 5, digitization. There's a lot of discussion on so-called next normal. We don't know what next normal will be, but one thing for sure is that digitization will certainly be a very, very critical element of the next normal. And there has been surging adoption of digital channels, and even in a less digitized industries are getting digitized because of this. For example, healthcare sector, which is one of the least digitized industries around the world and also in China. There is a big boom of internet hospitals because patients simply cannot go to the hospital, and also hospitals also discourage in-person visit to the clinics. And government also adopted very bold policy to allow more aggressive reimbursement for this internet hospital treatment, and that's likely to be a new normal, right, going forward as well. So that kind of massive digitization is likely to continue to happen. Number 8, the more forward-looking view, reimagining the future. So, for example, new future of work, right, especially the remote working, digital working, can stick, right? At some point, there were 300 million people in China adopting remote working, and there was a surge of the download or adoption of this productivity toolkit in the WeChat platform or app stores in China. And there are companies adopting and embracing this new working model, incorporating those virtual interaction with customers as part of the KPI, for example. Number 9 will be very relevant to the companies in Europe. The companies in China, they are also concerned about the slowdown in the domestic economy, and at the same time, they saw, what happened back in 2008, where, some of the aggressive M&A and consolidation efforts paid off. So, well-capitalized companies out of China, they could look at the global consolidation and M&A opportunities even more aggressively, and that globalization agenda is very high among the top companies in China. Number 10, design for the future, right? So, there will be also fundamental change in terms of consumer behavior and demand. For example, because, consumers are staying at home, they realize that actually the soundproof quality in terms of their apartments will be very critical, right? And then because they cannot go outside, the community services will become even more important. So therefore, there was a real estate company, they just changed their marketing pitch to cater to this demand in the short term and incorporate this input into their long-term product development. So here are some of the examples from China, how companies have responded, and still, a lot of them can be relevant to the companies in the Europe as well.
Okay, thank you, John. There's a question that came in, which is it possible that the Chinese economy goes into a decline in the fourth quarter onwards, since orders from the EU and the US will sharply decline? And is this current recovery just a straw fire?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So there are two uncertainties related to China's recovery. One is the resurgence of the virus, right? So China's domestic cases are relatively okay. Right now, majority of the cases are imported, so that's why China bans the entry of foreigners. So how strict China can be, right, going forward? There's one question mark. And then another risk is so-called asymptomatic cases, right? So about 20% of those cases are asymptomatic. How can you identify those patients and make sure that there's no second or third wave? So this is one risk. Another risk is global demand and supply, right? And then certain part of the value chain, especially automotive, they are heavily exposed to the global supply, right? So when there is a shutdown of the European factories and limited supply to China, especially the core components like engines, Chinese value chain need to shut down, right? So, but then there are also many other value chains where they are highly localized, like pharmaceutical or consumer, sometimes consumer electronics. In those cases, the shock from the global supply chain disruption could be less.
Okay. I'd like to ask Sven a question, which is, Jong-min was talking about how some of these 10 points could be relevant in Europe. How do you think Europe could look at China, and are there best practices here that we should be looking at?
I would say all of these 10 apply to Europe and the United States, for that matter, too. And I see different executives that I've been talking to picking elements of this, the accelerated digitization, mostly is one, the supplier part, lots of work being done, helping customers, redeploying staff. I actually think all of them. The one area where I'm most concerned that we don't take the full lesson of China, but also Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore, is just how tough the health and safety measures are in the opened up economy. And I think, you gave a lot of good examples of the complete testing in the factories and so on. Not just during the event, but also post the event. The community, the community immunity rather than the individual immunity and so on. All of that, I think, is still being processed in Europe and the US in terms of how that works. And I have this feeling that it's not sunk in enough how cautious that opening up is and how intense the health and safety measures are. And they're different, one is more a testing-driven thing, another one is more a community separation thing. If you compare Korea and China, it's a bit different. And there's a lot of innovation going on there. There's also a lot of innovation going on in Europe. But I think one of the lessons is it's still quite intense to keep it under control because we don't have herd immunity. And so it can go very quickly back to resurgence, which brings you in the second or the third wave. So that lesson, I think all the lessons are totally applicable. That particular one is I wanted to highlight as something that I miss a little bit, just sheer intensity.
Okay, a question coming in about trade. Does MGI see countries retreating from global trade and focusing on self-sufficiency outside of healthcare? And in that context, is there a risk of a trade war between the US and China escalating? That's for both.
I want to say something that's an important point. As an important point, just to be clear, already over the last 8 years before this event, the globalization was in the past measured by trade globalizing faster than GDP. So global trade growth and flows grew at 6, 7, 8, 9%, while GDP was at 3, 4, 5, something like that. And the doubling of that rate was basically the globalization. That number has converged to GDP already sort of 8 years ago. And regional trade was still faster than GDP growth, so but not global trade. Well, at the same time, we called out in our work on future trends that we were beyond globalization from that standpoint. There were many other areas where globalization was accelerating. Global communications was accelerating, global sharing of ideas was accelerating, certain technologies were accelerating and globalizing faster, and so on. Certain tastes were globalizing, other tastes were localizing. So it was a very nuanced picture on globalization as we went into this event. And there is a expectation that is often expressed, which is maybe behind this question, given this event, will we now just tighten down the borders even more? I think we are for the virus, but strangely enough, a fair amount of the mouth caps that go to the US come from China. A fair amount of the caps that come to my country come from China. So below what I would call the rhetoric, there's actually some globalization in this event too. Collaboration between companies and supply chain to fix them is another one. If I take the WHO, I know it's in the press today, but they were working on common standards to bring cheap ventilators to Africa and India so that everybody could go against the common standard and make it cheaper. So there was a fair amount of globalization. The one globalization that is super big right now is the globalization of ideas. Having Yao Ming here talk and share these 10 lessons is a globalization of ideas. And that to me is very strong. What I see more in the supply chain is the question about resilience. I don't think people want to be dependent on one form of supply without having checked that that one will exist. So I could imagine more doubling up of supply to be more resilient. Or whether that would end up by excluding China altogether, I'm not 100% sure that that is the direction we're going. But as this event unwinds, and maybe that's something that I also wanted to raise a little bit, is we need to all be aware that because of the size of this event, there will be some reckoning. And that will be a little noisy when it happens. I hope the innovation lesson of this event will be bigger than the reckoning of this event, because I think nobody wanted this virus. And that we can hold together on that. But somewhere, those ricochet effects will come.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, which is around the differences in the approach among European governments to ending the lockdown. We're seeing some countries doing shops, other countries doing schools. Sven, you talked about innovation. Perhaps you'd like to take that question. How are these different approaches going to play out, and do we have a sense of which might work better?
I don't think there's an answer on which might work better. First of all, each country has different population structures. Scandinavians are maybe doing something a little different, but they are less densely populated. So it might just make sense for that reason. So there's some real variation going on that requires real difference in response. But I think there's also real variation in learning together. And as Yao-Ming was saying, China has a wide variance too, by region, by sector, and so on, and how it's moving. And so I think we're in a place where we're all learning. And I see the variation more as multiple forms of innovation. And you also see that when certain governments did something different, they might go back to something that another government is doing, or then we might progress the other way around. I think this is still a learning event. You'll see the same with states in the United States that have different starting points. And as long as we keep learning from the collective innovation, that will bring us to a better place than just having a monolithic approach, because I don't think the answer is fully known. And that gives me the moment to round off this session, and we appreciate your attendance, your questions, and your attention. As leaders, you can't have all the answers now, but the question is, are you directing your efforts to good questions? Clearly, are you in a crisis also still having your mind towards the long term in terms of growth? Are you prepared for a wide range of scenarios, because it's still quite wide open in where this is going? Can you keep your organization play an innovation role in responding to the crisis, because the innovation that's happening collectively is large? Can you bring that to your company and maybe even accelerate some things that otherwise would have been stuck? Do not forget page number 4, which is, how will you protect your employees when it restarts? It's a very different question than how do you protect when it doesn't restart. There are many companies that are active and producing, of course, and they have this answer solved. But in certain jobs, it's not solved yet. And then do remind yourself that in a crisis, there will always be new opportunities around structural large changes that I hope you will capture. And as a result, we hope you can not only deal with this crisis, but also plan ahead to both safeguard lives and safeguard livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate your attendance. And thank you to our presenters, Jong-Min and Sven and Tara. Please do go and look at our McKinsey.com website. We have a lot of very interesting coronavirus-related coverage. And we hope you found this webinar interesting and informative. And finally, when you log off, there will be a 1-minute survey that will pop up on your screen. I will be very grateful if you could share your feedback with us on that. And with that, I wish you a very good day. Thank you very much indeed.